Hi, I'm Gareth Green, and in this video we're going to be thinking about the notation of choral music. And you can see on the screen we've got an example here, just a single page from a piece of music by Rossini, his Petite Messe, and it's just as an example of why we put music on 4 staves as we do. So if this is familiar to you, it will all be very obvious. But if it's new to you, as I know it is for some people who've been asking about how to deal with choral music notation, well, here's what it should look like. So you see that at the top of this page, we've got the sopranos on the top stave there in that first treble clef line. Then we've got the altos on the second line, reading the treble clef again. Then we have the tenors also reading the treble clef. We'll come back to that in a moment. And we have the basses reading the bass clef. Let's just talk about those tenors. When we're using this layout that we call open score, when each part has its own line, the tenors actually read in the treble clef. And you'll notice that all their notes are written actually an octave higher than they're going to sing it. You know, you wouldn't expect a tenor to be able to sing up there. The tenors are going to sing an octave lower. And you'll notice, if I scroll back to the clef at the beginning of that line, that there's a little 8 underneath their treble clef. So that says sing those notes an octave below the printed pitch. So this may seem rather bizarre. Why don't we just put the tenors in the bass clef? Actually, it's a good question in many ways. But there is a convention when we're laying out choral music in open score, each voice with its own line, its own stave, that in the tenor part, we put things in the treble clef. Now, if you were to put the notes at the pitch that they're actually sung, you would end up with lots of ledger lines below the stave. You know that first note in the tenor in bar 65 of this score? Well, the first note would be on 3 ledger lines below the treble clef. So then you'd be thinking, oh, how many ledger lines are there? What's this note? So it's much easier to read it when it's placed an octave higher than just to write that little 8 that means when it comes to it, sing it an octave lower than it's written. But you might look at this and say, well, why don't we just write this score in what we call short score? In other words, when you've got just 2 staves, you know, the sopranos and the altos share the treble clef stave, the tenors and the basses share the bass clef stave. That's how hymn tunes and Bach chorales and things are written. So why do we have to do this? Surely it takes up much more space on the page. And that's perfectly true. But I'm hoping that you can see from this that the music is more complex than it is in just a basic hymn tune or a basic song or a chorale or something. And this would get quite complicated to read, wouldn't it? All these triplets flying up and down all over the place. If you had the sopranos and altos sharing one stave, they've got different rhythms from each other. Sometimes you find there are notes sort of crossing over even. If you had the tenors and basses on the same stave, you'd have the same thing. You know, if you look, for example, in the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5th bar of this excerpt, you'll notice the tenors have gone down to an F at the end of that bar, that measure, and the basses are up above them, up here. And then, you know, they're kind of ducking and diving a little bit through there. So if you were writing them both on the same stave, it would be a real tangle of where do the parts go, which note is the tenor note, which note's the bass note. It will be much harder to read. So because the music is more complex than it would be in a basic hymn or a song or something, we lay it out in this open score in this way. And you can see also that at the beginning of that stave there, we've got a bracket which wraps itself around the 4 vocal parts. In this case, there's a piano part underneath, and you can see we've got this thing that we call a brace that is just kind of showing you where the piano part is at the bottom of that. But it might be an orchestral score, in which case it will be a lot more involved with the orchestral parts as well. But you'd expect to see the vocal parts laid out in this way. So this is just a fairly brief explanation of, well, what does this thing we call open score look like as opposed to short score, which is when they share the staves, Why do we need it? For the kind of reasons that we've explained. It's about the music being more complex. It's about parts overlapping, crossing over each other. So you've got complete clarity. So you can just concentrate on following your line and you're not going to get confused by somebody else sharing the same stave. But it's also worth noticing how the tenors operate in the treble clef. When you're in short score, they're in the bass clef. When you're in open score, they're in the treble clef, and they have that little 8 saying, actually sing the notes an octave lower than they're printed. And then that all makes sense of that. And when you see that bracket, you know those are the vocal parts. When you see the brace, you know that's the piano part. So that's great. And especially when you've got words as well. You notice that we've got a Latin text here, glorificamus te, but we've got different voices singing these words at different times. Can you imagine if you had all this shared on the same stave with stems going up and down, parts crossing over, words in different places? It would be far too difficult to read. So putting it in this open score like this just means that you can write music as complex as it needs to be, and you've got all the detail clearly laid out without any confusion at all. So that's just a brief explanation of why we would lay out a choral score in that kind of way.